What's up, you guys? Welcome back to Tidal Gardens. This video is all about aquascaping. I've got some tips and tricks for you. So real quick, funny story. This past week, I attended Reef Stock, and generally, I try to avoid speaking engagements or anything like that. But at the last second, I got peer pressured into doing an Aquascape competition. And I got partnered up with Brandy Camp. You might have seen her on our Reef Receipts videos. Anyway, I was dressed in like a three-piece suit and everything like that. I wasn't really in the mood to do an aquascaping competition. And I was joking to anybody around that would listen that I was going to intentionally throw this contest. But once the contest started, I was like, you know what? I'm just going to go ahead and at least help unbox these things and let's see where it goes. Turns out we ended up winning. So these are now tips and tricks from an award-winning aquascaper. Okay, so the first tip I have for you guys is to consider whether or not you're going to be gluing the rock together or you're just going to be stacking. Forever, that was kind of how it's done. You stack rocks together, that's how you get an aquascape. But a more recent trend is to actually go through and glue or cement these rocks together. And there are some benefits to each technique. Starting first with the stacking. What's nice is that it's very easily accessible. You don't have to have any specialized products, just the rock. The other nice thing about it is that you can always tweak these things as you go. You're not exactly married to any particular shape or anything like that. Gives you a lot of flexibility. The downside is you don't really have that ultra cohesive structure, and there's always a risk of that structure coming apart, toppling over. Worst case scenario, it falls on your favorite coral. So that's kind of the stacking option. Now, with gluing, the nice thing about gluing is that you can get into some really exotic shapes that would never really work out if you were just stacking. Like to have these long arches, cantilevering way over, things like that. Or those ultra thin, skeletal looking, practically balloon animal type aquascapes. That's not something you're going to just accidentally stack together. That all has to be glued. The nice thing about gluing is that oftentimes that glue bond is so strong that if the structure were to break, it's actually the stone that's breaking and not the bond. If you're interested in that technique, we've made an entire video all about it, so check that out. A major downside to having a really cool, ultra complex glued aquascape is the size of it. Oftentimes they start to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and it can be a challenge just to get that into your aquarium, especially if your aquarium has Euro braces or center braces, things of that sort. It can be both heavy and kind of like this tactical puzzle to squeeze it down in there. Now, obviously, you only really have to do that once. Not that big of a struggle, right? But the much bigger struggle is there are times when you actually want to get that aquascape out of the aquarium. Let's say that you have like an insane outbreak of something that's grown under the rock. You've tried everything, and this rock just has to come out and get bleached or whatever. At that point, it can be very challenging because a lot of corals might have been glued onto there. A lot of encrusting corals now call that home. Suddenly, it's a major obstacle. So that is an advantage to having like a stacked aquascape where components of it can come out for maintenance. Okay, tip number two. It's that consideration of whether you want to go with a design that's kind of more monolithic. I'm not even talking about like the wall of rock that was very, very popular in the 90s. I'm just talking about something that's just a little bit more massive versus, again, that super skeletal balloon animal type, exotically glued aquascape. When I first started messing with those really thin skeletal aquascapes, the thinking there was that you're kind of making a very breathable structure. There's a lot of room in there for like water flow versus something that's like hulking and monolithic. You can also kind of perch, especially like SPS, you can perch them way out on some little branch. It kind of has its own space to grow there just because there really isn't anything around. It's jutting out on its own little peninsula of sorts. However, the big benefit to something like that giant monolith is that a lot of fish seem to prefer those structures rather than the super skeletal stuff. I always thought that fish would like all those intricate caves and everything and arches that the skeletal designs offer. But in practice, it almost helps to throw in more, for lack of a better term, a mound of rubble. I've found that sometimes when fish start to get ultra aggressive around each other, adding in more rocks in that style seem to help out a lot. So whether you go for one style or the other or a hybrid of the two, that's something to take into account in your initial planning. Tip number 3, and this is a really big one. It is giving enough space away from every glass side. A beginner mistake that a lot of people make is to kind of stack the rock against the back glass. When you do that, it makes that back glass practically impossible to scrape. When you have room all the way around it, again, you can get a magnet or a scraper blade in there very, very easily. If a coral frag of any kind drops behind the aquascape, not a big deal. You can go down, reach there and grab it. It opens the door for multiple viewing angles potentially, especially something like a peninsula, right? You want to have everything away from all those glass sides. And the last big benefit to doing that is it also opens up that entire channel for more flow. So theoretically, you could have a pump that kind of like blasts like a big U-shaped thing all the way around your aquascape. Obviously, aquariums that are more narrow front to back, I think that's going to be a little bit more of a challenge to accomplish this. And that's kind of why I tend to go towards aquariums that are at least 24 inches front to back, preferably a little bit more. And in my biggest show tanks, they are 48 inches front to back. And at that point, you can do a whole lot with aquascapes. Okay, tip number 4. A big mistake that I often see when people are making these really elaborate aquascapes is that they go very high. You build these things up and they're practically touching the water line at that point. I think in our excitement to make these cool aquascapes, we kind of forget that this is supposed to be like the structure upon which to grow other things. And those other things like to grow up. So my general rule is I try to make sure that the aquascape does not go past the halfway point. In some shallower aquariums, like I'd say maybe 24 inches or less, you're kind of limited because I mean a 12-inch aquascape, kind of short. At that point, maybe 2/3 only reserved for like a small portion, like 2/3 aquascape, 1/3 open space, and try to minimize that encroachment as much as possible because so many corals, you will underestimate just how big they grow and just how much vertical space they take up. Also, remember, in an ideal world, you would have so much coral growth that you practically can't see the rock. So don't really get married to what the rock looks like on day one. Hopefully, you'll never notice it again. Next tip, consider how many structures you actually want in the aquarium. Now, this is a total personal preference thing, but I like having one big major structure and maybe one or two smaller structures throughout the aquascape. And the reason why I like that, it kind of it takes your eye on a journey through the tank visually, but also when it comes time to place corals, it makes you automatically more disciplined in giving corals more space away from one another. I think that sometimes people make the mistake of planting corals too close to one another, and it turns out that that little bit of aggression turns into a lot of bit of aggression once those two things start to grow towards one another. So when you have multiple structures, it already kind of has that buffer zone built in, and for the long term, that works out nicely. Also, visually, when you separate the corals completely entirely onto their own rocks, it's a cool aesthetic. Taking that one step further about isolation, there are some corals that you simply don't want on the main aquascape, like certain encrusting corals. They are wonderful, but they are a wonderful coral that will dominate the entire thing if left to their own devices. Certain encrusting corals like Montipora, Leptoceras, even some of the more aggressive things like Pavona, like there's encrusting Pavonas, which look really, really cool, but they like to sting and they like to encrust quickly. So that is something that might be best on its own rock, separated so that it never really encroaches on any other corals. Tip number 6, substrate or no substrate. This particular tip really kind of deserves its own video, its own discussion. However, I'll just touch on it here. Whether you choose to have a substrate or not is going to have a dramatic visual impact on your aquascape. Now, sometimes people like to have extremely high flow systems, like for Acropora specific tanks, and so they might shy away from a lot of substrate. Sometimes folks want to stay away from substrate because although they look great initially, over time they might get a little funky, and even at that point aesthetically they might not look great because there's certain types of like boring green algae and stuff like that that really like to grow on chunks of aragonite. And so you kind of have this minty looking substrate rather than this pearly white substrate. Again, lots of considerations, but personally I happen to like the look of substrate. Here, we are almost entirely bare bottom because the guys have it in their head that substrate is higher maintenance. I'm really not sure if that's the case, but I would have a revolt on my hands if all these tanks had substrate. Having said that, one of our favorite big coral wholesalers that does a lot of coral farming, their entire farming system has substrate. So it is possible to do on this scale. Going back to what we touched on about with islands, having a substrate and islands is like a double layer of isolation. So, for example, if you wanted to have like Xenia or green star polyp, that is something that likes to encrust on an entire rock. But on a bare bottom tank, it still can travel pretty quickly to the next rock over. In that case, having a substrate is like an insurance layer because for whatever reason, certain corals would rather grow on rock than sand. And by having that sand moat, you basically eliminate the risk of encroachment onto other corals that way. Okay, guys, tip number 7, last tip. What are you going to do with your background? It's not, I guess, technically not an aquascape thing, so this is a bonus. I personally like to have a jet black background. It really sets off and separates the aquascape away from that black glass. And so when you see like a lot of your branching corals, they stand out so well against that black background. However, I know that a lot of folks, they like to grow stuff on their back glass, which cool story, go for it if that's your aesthetic. I tend to think that it drowns things out visually, but there's a lot of cool corals that you can grow on the back glass that I've seen. Xenia, green star polyp, I've seen a lot. People have an entire like zoanthid mosaic because turns out zoanthids really do like to grow on a vertical pane of glass. Even like plating Montipora glued onto the back glass and having it plate forward, it's a cool effect. Personal preference, I like to have it as simple as possible to, I guess, accentuate that negative space. But your taste may be completely different than mine. It's your tank. Either one will work, but it is a consideration off the top. Okay, guys, that does it from here. Hope you learned something about aquascaping, and until next time, happy reefing.